Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Reed Walker. President Trump was not the first choice for many Christian leaders or voters in the 2016 election. In the eyes of many Bible-believing Americans, then candidate Trump was a former social liberal, and his occasional vulgarity, multiple marriages and divorce, and tabloid scandals made it unimaginable that he would defend Christian values in public life, or so they thought. In stark contrast to Christianity Today editor Mark Lee's viral essay asserting President Trump should be removed from office, our next guest argues that President Trump has been the most ardent and effective presidential defender of religious liberty and pro-life cause since Ronald Reagan, and perhaps in U.S. history. He pushes back against left-wing evangelicals trying to shame Christians into turning against Trump, revealing how liberals hope to demoralize Christians and thus defeat Donald Trump, and reverses pro-life, pro-family, pro-religious freedom policies. Why Trump is the most pro-Israel president in American history, and why that should matter to all Christians in America. Why never Trump Christians naively preach de facto political surrender. The sincerity of President Trump's defense of the Christian faith, and why it delivered policy victories when other pro-Christian presidents haven't. Dr. Ralph Reed is founder and chairman of Faith and Freedom Coalition, a pro-family public policy organization with over 2 million members. He's worked on 11 presidential campaigns and currently serves on the pro-life and evangelicals for Trump committees for President Trump's re-election campaign. He chaired the Georgia Republican Party and was a senior advisor to both George W. Bush presidential campaigns. He was the executive director of the Christian Coalition from 1989 to 1997. The Wall Street Journal has called him perhaps the finest political operative of his generation. He's chairman and CEO of Century Strategies, a public relations firm. He earned a bachelor's from the University of Georgia and a PhD in history from Emory University. Joining us now to talk about his new book, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump, is Dr. Ralph Reed. Ralph, welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you on, and I honor your work. I moved to Birmingham from Atlanta, and I was in Atlanta from 1975 till I came here with a short stint in California, so I'm familiar with you, your work, and actually the Jewish community's position against Donald Trump, as it's been fairly against Donald Trump since the onset, including my 94-year-old mother in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that I'm a registered independent. That's the only reason why she hasn't disowned me. If I was a registered Republican, she would have tossed me out a long time ago. It's tough enough to have a Jewish believing rabbi as a son in the Jewish community, but to have me be a Republican would just be the death knell to end it all. So, so I have firsthand experience of spending 44 years in the Jewish community, and actually was very heavily involved in the Jewish community and came to faith in Roswell, Georgia. So that's very near and dear to my heart. Donald Trump, style versus content has been the debate. People don't like his style. Mm-hmm. They don't look at the content. You have enumerated in your book the long list of accomplishments of this presidency and the promises of his candidacy, which, biblically speaking, he could have been perceived as the I wills of Isaiah, because every politician speaks the very words of Satan, that if I'm elected, I will. And Satan spoke those very words that in Isaiah, that if you follow me, I will ascend to the throne of heaven. I will do all these things. And it seems to be the mantra of running the parallels between politics and a seemingly evil agenda. But your point of view of the Christian case for Trump kind of says, I'm going to what's the word they use in court? I'm going to stipulate to these knowns. He has a propensity for profanity. He tweets out argumentative statements. He doesn't act with a Christian form of grace, tolerance, forgiveness, and understanding to his enemies. He doesn't love his enemies. He's fairly unforgiving and unrelentless towards his enemy. Is not an icon of Christian values, but yet is a great defender of Christian values. How do we reconcile that, which is an expectation? It's a false expectation, because it's like saying that the person who goes to church who thinks that they're a righteous evangelical Christian is not a sinner. They may not be sinning in that hour.
Right.
That may be the only hour in which they are not sinning. But why do we not remember, judge not lest you be judged, by the same measure you judge another, so you shall be judged? Can we really look in the mirror and say that I'm any better in my thought life, in my positions, than this President of the United States that happens to act, and I'm going to take a lot of flack for this, but he's the Jesus that flipped over tables. He's the one that called them the synagogue of Satan. He's the one that called them a brood of vipers. He's the one that said to his closest cabinet members, "Are you so dull? How long will I put up with you?" The tweets of Donald Trump and the tweets of Jesus seem to sound an awful lot alike when they rub against what God has to say about righteousness. What's your take on that?
Well, there's a lot there to unpack. I would say I have two major responses to those who argue, well, I can't support him because of his language. I can't support him because of the insults. I can't support him because of the tweets, or, these various other reservations about style. I'll preface it by saying, just to be clear, I wrote the book not primarily as a defense of Donald Trump, although I defend the president plenty in the book, and proudly so. As you mentioned, I have a roughly 30-page appendix that details all the accomplishments that he achieved just in the first 3 years of his administration. And it's an unbelievable list of accomplishments, including the appointment of conservative and pro-life judges, moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, achieving a sweeping rewriting of NAFTA to the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. The other things he's done on trade, the construction of a border barrier, withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, the largest tax cut since the Reagan era. I mean, it's extraordinary, whatever you think of him personally. But the reason why I wrote the book was not primarily that. It was primarily because Christians who gave him between 81 and 86% of their votes, depending upon how you define Bible-believing Christians. If you ask Rabbi the question, are you an evangelical? He got 81% of their votes, highest ever recorded. If you ask if you're a Bible-believing conservative Christian, that's about 35% of the electorate. They gave him 86% of their votes, okay? Highest ever recorded. And they've been called hypocrites, spiritual frauds. They've been accused of selling out the gospel for 30 pieces of silver. They've been told that they're guilty of spiritual and moral bankruptcy simply to get a few items on their policy agenda. And I wrote the book to defend them and to defend the church and the faith community. And I think the defense is really this. It's twofold. And I go through it in great detail in my book. The first is, as a matter of credential judgment, we are called upon as citizens to choose leaders in a free society that we believe advance the common good and advance the moral good the most. And we are called to resist those leaders, those constituencies, those parties, for lack of a better term. I don't necessarily mean a political party, but those entities that are advancing grave moral evils. And my argument in 2016 and today is, are there times when Donald Trump says or tweets something that I wish he wouldn't? Sure there are. But you know what? That's generally true of any president that you have. They're going to say things you don't agree with. They're going to do things you don't agree with. I don't mean to diminish it. It does matter, and it factored in very large for a lot of Christians. I mean, I detail in the book that some of them were very reluctant to vote for Trump, and some of them were dragged kicking and screaming to the altar. You know, they were not only for Ted Cruz or Huckabee or somebody else in the primaries, they didn't like Trump. But in the end, as a matter of prudential judgment, he gets up and says, if you elect me president, I'm going to appoint one of these 21 people to the Supreme Court. At the very moment you have a vacancy on the court, you have an administration in the Obama-Biden administration, where Hillary was Secretary of State, that I would argue, Rabbi, was the most anti-Israel since the founding of the modern state of Israel. They attacked the Israeli government on so-called settlements, which are nothing more than communities in Judea and Samaria. They sought to undermine the state of Israel at every turn, including, by the way, intervening in an Israeli election and trying to defeat the duly elected prime minister of a sovereign country and arguably our best ally. And I could go on and on. That's Biden's record. It was Hillary's record. Okay. She was for abortion on demand up until the moment of birth, paid for with tax dollars. So is Biden. Donald Trump said he was pro-life, and he's proven to be pro-life. Defunding Planned Parenthood, speaking to the March for Life, the first president in history to do so, appointing pro-life judges, restoring and strengthening the Mexico City policy. So the argument is one of moral content. It is advancing those goods and resisting the grave moral evils that the other agenda represents. And I reject the idea very strongly that we were choosing then or now between the lesser of two evils. That's just simply not the case. Defending innocent human life is not the lesser of two evils. It's a moral good. Being the best friend Israel has ever had behind the Resolute desk is not the lesser of two evils. It's a good. It's a moral good. The second argument I make that I'll, do more briefly is more of a biblical argument. It's a gospel argument, which is that God, in his sovereignty, which is absolute and total, is not limited in achieving his ends to selecting morally upright people in leadership positions. Okay? God does not confine himself to having either a devout Jew or a Bible-believing, very morally upright, sanctified Christian as his vehicle to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And I give many examples of this in Scripture. I'll just give one from the New Testament, where in the book of Acts, it records that the Apostle Paul is arrested for inciting a riot in Jerusalem when he's preaching the gospel. And the Romans centurions, the Roman soldiers, tie him up and they're getting ready to flog him. And he turns around and he says, "Are you allowed to do this to a Roman citizen?" And they are immediately afraid. They untie him. They make sure that he doesn't fall into the hands of those that wanted to kill him. They protect him. And he ultimately appeals his case all the way to Caesar, which was the most sacred right of a Roman citizen. Can you imagine, Rabbi, if you and I had a right as an American citizen to walk into the Oval Office and have the President of the United States hear our legal case? Well, we don't have that right. We can go to the Supreme Court. We can't go to the president. But under Roman law, if you were a Roman citizen, you could appeal to the emperor, and he did. Now, that emperor was a child molester, a sexual deviant, a murderer, and a tyrant. He was a pedophile. But Paul didn't say, well, I can't appeal to him. He's not a moral person. What did he say? He said, I have rights as a Roman citizen. And if there's someone who will defend my right, I'm going to appeal to them. And I don't care if it's Donald Trump, Tiberius Caesar, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, or Mahatma Gandhi. if there is someone who is willing to defend your rights as a citizen, the right to life, the right to religious freedom, the right to assemble, as Donald Trump has proven himself willing to do, then you have every right to appeal to them, especially when his opponent says he's going to take all those rights away. So that's the argument of the book. I hope and pray it's a compelling argument, and I hope that it will help equip Christians and others of goodwill during this very critical election.
One of the points that you make in the book is that Donald Trump stands for a constitutional America. And
Right.
so in order to have a constitutional America, let's take a look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States and see what you validate and confirm in your argument. And I'll just go into this part of the Declaration of Independence in Congress, July 4, 1776. Skip the first part. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So this is a constitutional, non-racist, believing in the equality of all men, that all are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, okay, pro-life, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, that you cannot impose by your unlawful or lawful assembly. You do not have the right in America to forcibly remove my liberty by forcing your agenda, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, whatever the cause may be, to force me to submit or surrender through violent methods. You're opposed to the Constitution, which gives me the freedom of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, meaning that I have the freedom in this country to pursue what I define as happiness down to the individual level as a given right to me under the Constitution of the United States. Donald Trump has been an avid defender of those three fundamental principles and appointed people to the judiciary that supports life. Okay? That means that in my lifetime, and I'm about 9 or 10 years older than you are, in my lifetime I remember prayer in school, and I remember it being removed. I remember the Pledge of Allegiance in school and the raising of the flag, and it was removed. I remember Roe v. Wade during my lifetime. You were a young man. I was much older at that time. I had already graduated college. I remember that, and I was appalled that the legalization, and that this was not even by a legislative body. This was by a decision by the judiciary branch, which cannot enact a law, does not have the ability to pass a law, that cannot legislate under the separation of powers within the government, the three branches of government. So here we have a president that comes along and begins to tip the tables and saying, hey, judiciary, you don't have the right. And he had good legal advisors. You had Trey Gowdy. You had a number of people who came out of the legal profession advising him, saying, whoa, you need to have constitutionally sound people who are willing to stand up for the Constitution. The Constitution cannot give the judiciary the power to legislate. They can only determine and interpret this in relationship to the Constitution. I would maintain that Roe v. Wade robs me of one of my inalienable rights, and that is the right to life. That is granted to me endowed by my Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that right is life. Roe v. Wade removes that from my constitutional right and legislates abortion. That's problematic. And anybody who says that, they say, well, you know, you just don't understand. You're too right-leaning for me. Well, I'm sorry. I'm constitutionally, I'm God correct and constitutionally correct. I don't care about the man. I care about the one who supports the agenda of the United States of America, of this republic, and that's the case that you make in the book.
Right.
When we come down to this, you are actually challenging Christians' faith. What do you actually believe is your foundation of faith? Do you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible? And do you believe that God is sovereign? And if you believe that God is sovereign, there are certain things in God's economy which are absolutes. Okay? Murder of any kind. Unborn, born, I knew you before you were in your mother's womb. Murder is murder, the taking of a life, and having people parse embryonic decisions to determine when does life begin. We have a president that says conception. Life begins at conception. If you're pregnant, you have a life, and therefore that life should not be terminated, not by an act of Congress, not by an act of the Supreme Court and the judiciary, and he's been a strong component. But for me, the number one issue, biblical issue, is that we have a 4,500-year history based on one passage of Scripture, and that's Genesis 12:3, which says, I will bless those that bless thee, and I will curse those that curse thee. And if you are a student of history, that you know that in 4,500 years, every empire that has ever stood against Israel has fallen. There has never been a successful empire that ever stood against Israel that stands today. The last one that fell was the Soviet Union. The one prior to that falling, right, was the British Empire. It used to be said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Now the sun barely rises on the British Empire because of what they did in turning against Israel, not in 1948, but later on in their brokering dealings with the Arabs, and ultimately lost everything. Now you saw the former Soviet Union, the persecution of the Jews, the persecution of my own family, in the shtetls and the pogroms, and the fall of the Iron Curtain and the destruction of that empire. Now America has a choice of, are we on the blessing side of this equation, the curse side of this equation? And for me, this is the number one biblical issue. Jew or Gentile, Christian, non-Christian, largest issue spoken by God that says, if you want to be a nation under blessing, you will stand with Israel. And he has been resolute in his positions on Israel. Why does that matter to the average Christian? Because you believe in the Jewish Messiah and he's coming back to Israel. He's not coming to Philadelphia. He's not coming to Toledo. He's not coming to a divided city, and he's not coming to a divided nation. God says, never again will my nation be divided. Never will there be two states. Never will be there Israel and Judea. There will only be a unified Israel. This is why we're seeing this annexation. This is why we're seeing God's plan unfolding, and we have a president in the White House who, for the first time, is taking proactive measures to support this agenda that means that the United States remains under the blessings of God, who says that I will visit the iniquity of the father for those who hate me to the third and fourth generation, but I will visit to the 1000th generation of those who love me and live according to my command. My number one command was to bless Israel, and this is a president that has done that. There become secondary and tertiary issues, and we seem to be a people that like to parse the minutia, style versus content, but when you come down to the deal-breaking issues of the day, Joe Biden was just quoted as saying, I will do everything in my power to promote abortion. I have a 31-year-old adopted daughter who is the daughter biologically of a 15-year-old girl who ran away from home from Chicago to San Diego, California, because her parents wanted her to terminate her pregnancy. She felt it was morally wrong. She ran away from home. She went to live with her sister. I got a call from an attorney to adopt a child whose life would not be 31 years old in a couple of weeks, who gave me my first grandchild, would not exist had this young girl not had the moral fiber to stand up against her parents and run away from home, even though abortion was legal. This is something that is just appalling to me, but I'm a direct beneficiary because of the fact that she had a choice. and she was able to get support through pro-life organizations that offer support for those who are considering abortion. This is a Christian issue. This is a believer's issue. This is a biblical issue, and you build that Christian case for this issue, not because he's politically or he is a statesman, but he also clearly said in Tulsa, I've only run for one political office and I won it. I'm not a politician. If you brand me as a politician, I fail at every level because I'm not a statesman. I'm a deal maker. I'm a businessman. I run the economy in this country like a businessman. You want somebody with that gifting to be at the helm of this country that knows what the priorities are. The history that you have with various campaigns uniquely qualifies you to look behind the curtain at various presidential campaigns and various presidents and analyze them from a biblical worldview. Is Donald Trump the Christian choice for America to maintain and restore Christian, Judeo-Christian values in this country, or at least continue them for the duration of his presidency?
Well, I think if you look at the chapter that I have in the book about the selection of Mike Pence, who is a deeply committed, devout evangelical Christian, full spectrum conservative, one of the most respected members of Congress when he was there. He's the real deal. He doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. And I go through the process of how he was selected. And I make the argument that there is no way to look at who was available to Donald Trump to select as his governing partner and conclude that he selected Mike Pence by accident. He had to want someone of that faith witness, of that moral compass, of that philosophical rooting. Those kind of picks just don't happen by accident. Now, you could write it off if you just said, well, you know, that's just Mike Pence. You know, he was sort of out there. You know, he wanted a Boy Scout and an altar boy from the Midwest because it would kind of take some of the resistance off of some of Trump's stylistic flair, particularly in the Midwest. But then after he becomes president, to select Nikki Haley, deeply committed Christian, to be UN ambassador, to select Mike Pompeo, deeply committed evangelical Christian, to be Secretary of State, to select Sonny Perdue as Secretary of Agriculture, who's a committed Christian and a good friend of mine. I happened to be state party chairman when Sonny Perdue won that governor's race, and was privileged to be a good friend of him during that whole period. And he's the real deal too. And I will tell you a story. I ran into one senior administration official who's been a friend of mine for 25 years, committed believer in Christ. And he told me, I ran into him on the street in Washington, and he said, Ralph, I can't walk 25 feet in any cabinet department building, in any agency, or the White House complex without running in to either a born-again evangelical Christian or a faithful, observant Roman Catholic who I have worked with for 20 years or more. And I can tell you categorically, in terms of our policy agenda of right to life, religious freedom, support for Israel, constitutional judges, defunding Planned Parenthood, strengthening the family through the child tax credit, in the case of my organization, criminal justice reform, to replace the failed secular policies of mass incarceration with a biblical model of redemptive justice and compassionate and loving alternatives to incarceration, Trump has been the best on the totality of those issues that we've ever had. And that's not, by the way, a criticism of anybody who came before. I mean, we've had some great champions. You know, I worked for Ronald Reagan. He was a great champion for us. I worked for both Bushes, and George W. Bush was and remains a dear friend of mine. And as you know, Rabbi, he was strongly pro-Israel. I would argue he was the most pro-Israel president we'd had up until that time. So this is not a criticism of anybody else. And, you know, in the Reagan era, we had a saying, and it's a saying I never forgot. Personnel is policy. If you don't want to have to fight policy issues inside an administration, then make sure that the personnel that is in charge of the policy is solid as a rock philosophically. And I just find it amusing that so many people think that the president doesn't, you know, get it in terms of these spiritual issues and these biblical issues. If that were the case, why has he surrounded himself with so many people who have devoted their entire adult lives to advancing those moral goods? Those kind of things just don't happen by accident. So, I mean, even something, you know, as a Messianic rabbi yourself, you know, selecting Jay Sekulow to be the head of his legal team. I mean, Jay's been a friend and a colleague for almost 30 years. Again, it's not accidental. He is whatever you think of him personally, and you can think whatever you want. I happen to know him personally, and I detail in the book that I was pleasantly surprised at how the Donald Trump that I got to know was so different than the public image and the caricature. He's a man of compassion. He's a patriot. He cares deeply about these issues. He loves his country, and he wants the church to have its voice again in society. And he means it sincerely. So that's the best way I can answer your question.
As we see the media, and looking at
Yeah.
the 7 pillars of influence, and media being one of those strong pillars of influence, religion being one of those strong pillars of influence, entertainment being one of those strong pillars of influence, the deck's been stacked against him for a long time. There has been this agenda to nullify his election from even prior to his, once he was nominated, the fallout began, and they have thrown every weapon at him that's possible. What can we do as harbingers of truth? Mm-hmm. And that's our commitment. I'm going to err on the side of truth, not on the err on the side of being a man pleaser. I'm a devoted God pleaser, and I'm going to be God correct, not man correct. The mainstream media hates them. They are an arm of the liberal agenda. This is something that exists. Has America, because of COVID-19 and stuck in front of their television sets, not in front of their Bibles? I just spent an hour and 35 minutes talking with George Barna a couple of days ago about this very thing, is that America's not turning to their Bibles. They're turning to their news channels, and to Netflix binging, and to everything else that can keep their mind off their circumstance. But those that do size of crowds and off-the-cuff statements that are being made, and you know, you don't see him sitting like the fireside chats with his Bible in his lap, where he is sitting in a rocking chair reading by firelight like Abraham Lincoln did to garner the kind of vote. He doesn't pander to any particular audience. He is just pro-America. Do you feel that that works to his disadvantage? Do you feel like you have to be first convicted to your faith and committed to your faith before you can actually see him through the lens that you and I see him through?
It's a great question. And it's almost an academic question at this point because, he is who he is. And I think sometimes we forget what an extraordinary historical phenomenon we are witnessing in front of our eyes. I mean, from the time the Constitution was, written in 1787 through today, we've never had a president who ran for office for the very first time, having never spent a minute in public life, having never run for office, having never held elective office, having never even been involved in politics, having never held an appointive office, and run for president and won in American history, unless you were a war hero. Like William Henry Harrison in, I guess it was 1840. He was a war hero. Obviously, Eisenhower, Ulysses S. Grant. There's never been anything like this in American history. And you're talking about a man who was a real estate developer in Manhattan, a reality TV star, a best-selling author, and basically a global celebrity. And to get upset because he's unconventional is, at this point, a little disingenuous. I mean, this is who we were electing. In other words, he didn't, he may sometimes say things that offend people and are hurtful, politically in the short term. But in the global picture, I don't believe he would have ever beaten Hillary Clinton if he'd have been a conventional politician who'd spent, 20, 30, 40 years running for office, wearing a blue suit and a red tie. I just don't believe that. And I think he's a disruptor. He's a change agent. You used the analogy earlier of turning over the tables of the money changers in the temple, draining the swamp, call it whatever you will. But the American people wanted somebody, after decades of being promised one thing during campaigns and then never seemingly getting those campaign promises fulfilled, of either party. And they looked at both parties and they saw all they were doing was bickering and they weren't really solving the problems. And they wanted somebody who was outside the system, who was not of the system, who was going to go in and take it on. And he did, and he has. And he does it every day. And as a result, it should not be surprising to any of us. None of us should be rattled. None of us should be surprised. None of us should be discouraged that every single day they try to smear him, they lie about him, they try to destroy him, they lie about his family, they attack his children, they attack his wife. Every single day. They've investigated him for years. I mean, a former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, spent 2 years and $40 million looking at everything in this man's personal, business, and political life and found nothing. And that didn't stop them at all. They immediately, as soon as that was over, they then began an impeachment proceeding over a phone call that he had with the president of Ukraine. And now, there's a flap about the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, which they were just pleading and praying that maybe he would deliver them of Donald Trump. So I have to be honest with you, Rabbi, I'm at this point, in my career, working on my 11th presidential campaign, I've mostly been in that conventional political world. But it never bothered me that he was outside that realm and that he was as unconventional stylistically as he was. And I'll tell you why. Because I don't believe that he would have ever had the guts to advance the unconventional policy agenda if he hadn't also been personally and stylistically an iconoclast. Only that kind of person would do it. And the analogy that I have used is Brett Favre, the former NFL quarterback. I mean, if he was running around in the pocket and nobody was open, he would look 60 yards down the field and see a flash of a green sleeve of a Packer receiver. And off of his back foot, as somebody was tackling him, he would hurl the ball in the air. And it was either going to be a touchdown or an interception, but he was going to try to win.
Right.
And, you can criticize Brett Favre all you want for the mistakes he made along the way, but he brought the Packers back after decades of mediocrity and losing, and he won a Super Bowl. And that's kind of the way I look at it. I think that's Trump's personality.
As we look at the far left and the advancing agenda of a cacophony of voices pandering to everything from anarchy to rewriting the history of America and forcing a incredibly liberal agenda, moving towards it's right out of the Marxist playbook. It's right out of the advancement of socialism. It will bring the destruction of this nation as an energy resource to the world, as a economically sound. If we were to put in Joe Biden, who has no platform, who has no agenda, and is only a talking head for a group of pedophiles, anarchists, socialists, Marxists, Islamic friendly, funded by every disruptive organization that in any other country would be considered terrorists. We use a very loose term in this country for an enemy of the state. I find them to be enemies of the state. I'm not in a legislative position, so I can voice my opinion, but I find them as enemies of my freedom because I can't express my voice without having an attack come against me to stifle my voice. That's not America. That's not the America that I grew up in. That's not the America my parents came to settle in this country so that they could have the freedom of speech and to raise up a generation of children who had education and had a voice, and we were trained and taught to use our voice for the common good, not just for our own advancement, our own agenda, but for the benefit of others. There is no platform, just the same way there is no agenda for the rallies and the protests that are taking place. There's 17 different organizations involved with 17 different agendas, and violence is at the core of it. So if we can't get them to see our way, we'll just force them to do it. Our major cities are suffering. Donald Trump is trying to restore America and rebuild America in the face of a COVID-19 pandemic or pandemonium. I'm not sure what it really is. Is it the greatest PR scandal that's ever been perpetuated against the globe? I don't know. History will tell, but right now in the midst of it, it's hard to say. What is the competing agenda? It doesn't seem like the competing agenda is anything that Donald Trump stands for, we stand against. It's almost like Islam. We don't have our own agenda. We're just relative. We're just comparative. We're better than this. We have only this. Our God's better than your God. Everything's comparative. There's no original thought in the Quran, and there seems to be no original thought coming out of the Democratic Party.
I guess I would say this. I think there's definitely the overwhelming impulse of this is anti-Trump, and it's oppositional. It's not really aspirational. If you look at some of the polling, I'm going to do this from memory, so I hope I get it right, but I think it was either the most recent Fox News poll or NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, where they found that basically 60 to 65% of Biden voters are voting against Trump. They're not voting for Biden. there's very little enthusiasm or excitement for him at all. And in the case of Trump voters, it's flipped. Two-thirds of Trump voters say they're excited and enthusiastic and they're voting for him. Why? For really all the reasons we've been talking about during this show. His policies, his personnel, his leadership, his willingness to put America first, his defense of Israel, all of those things they like, and they admire his toughness and his willingness to endure this opposition. I think there's another piece to this, though. It isn't just that they stand for nothing and they're against Trump. Let's be very clear. They stand for very specific things, like the Green New Deal, which will destroy this economy, ban fracking in the United States, outlaw fossil fuels, lead to massive tax increases on middle-class families because they'll be forced to purchase new and different cars, and they'll be forced to pay the higher prices of so-called alternative energy. That's a very extreme agenda item. Their other agenda item is, it goes under the slogan of Medicare for all, but what it really is socialized government-run healthcare, where they make every decision, including whether or not you're going to get access to care or not, whether or not there's room for you at the hospital. And it will include, by the way, abortion on demand under government-run healthcare paid for with the tax dollars of pro-life citizens. In terms of their foreign policy, it's really back to the future. It's a return back to the weakness, the vacillation, and the globalism of the Obama-Biden years. And in terms of the economy, it's bringing back all the crushing, job-killing regulations of the Obama years, which Trump got rid of. He lifted regulations on energy. We're now the leading energy producer in the world. We're now exporting oil and natural gas all over the world. All of that was kept under wraps by Obama, under his radical environmental agenda. And finally, $4.1 trillion in new taxes. And that's just what Biden is admitting to. Now, just to give you a little bit of comparison, just 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was running on a tax increase of only $1 trillion. So Joe Biden is taking her $1 trillion tax increase and raising it fourfold. This is the largest tax increase that has ever been advocated by any presidential candidate in American history, both in absolute terms and as a share of GDP or the economy. So this is a very radical agenda. And I would argue that particularly and sadly and tragically, with the Ilhan Omars and the AOCs, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but the woman who is the Somali, she's came here from Somalia and then became an American citizen. She's also in Congress, and they've shifted the center of gravity in the Democratic Party to where it is no longer, at the grassroots anyway, it's no longer pro-Israel. I mean, remember when the House had under Pelosi passed the resolution condemning anti-Semitism, they had to include all these other things like racism and other things because it was bad form for them to just condemn anti-Semitism. And so I would argue that in addition to all the other things I've said, the modern Democratic Party is no longer, at least at the grassroots, pro-Israel.
And it is a challenge for you as a Christian to determine how committed you are to the Bible and to the God of the Bible in your walk. Can you be a gay Christian? Can you be an abortion supporting Christian? according to the Word of God. And this book, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump, takes you through an analysis of the man, the policies, and the Bible in looking through a biblical lens, through a biblical prism, at the Donald Trump legacy and the Donald Trump future. And you to decide, using the tools that God gave you, which was His Word, and well orchestrated and defended by Dr. Ralph Reed, who has now worked on 11 presidential campaigns, brings unique insight into this narrative and points that many of you have never considered, plus a 30-page document recording the accomplishments in just 3.5 years of this presidency. Dr. Ralph Reed, thank you for sharing this with us here on Revealing the Truth. May God bless all the works of your hands.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Good to be with you.
Good to
God
be
bless
with
you
you.
and your work.
Thank you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring in the next edition of Revealing the Truth.